Publishing and Research. This is our fourth webinar in our new Publishing and Research Communications webinar series. And so we're so pleased to have you joining with us today. We know that people will continue to join, but because we have a lot of ground to cover, we're just going to start quite promptly. My name's Carol Hollier, and I'm one of the volunteers with the Research for Life Training Committee. And I have with me another volunteer, Victoria Babbitt, and we together will be facilitating this webinar. And I'll introduce our speakers in one moment. But first, as you probably already know because you've signed up for this, our webinar today is part of a bigger series, a 6-part series that covers the research cycle for publishing and research communications. And so you can register for future webinars, and you can also, if you'd like to, watch the recordings of ones that have already happened. We're going through the entire process from the beginning to actually disseminating your research and increasing the impact of it. And so we hope that this will all be of interest to you. This research series is a collaboration among multiple Research for Life partners. So our target audience is people who are from Research for Life eligible countries. And the recordings and materials will all be freely available on our website. You can see the link there. And what we're going to be doing is we're trying to address the challenges that face our users in each of the sessions. And so today we are focusing on understanding publishing ethics. And of course, that's a very broad potential topic, but we're going to look at in this session, have an introduction and an overview to the common types of issues which can arise. Also help you gain a deep understanding of what publishing ethics are and why they're important for the integrity of research and for science in general. Also help you learn about 4 of the most common issues that we see in terms of publishing ethics. And we'll do this by looking at case studies and having discussions. And finally, we'll look at, learn about authorship issues, duplicate submissions and publication, originality issues, and data manipulation, as well as consent. So I'd like to introduce our speakers today, our presenters. We're really pleased to have Dr. Sabina Alam, who is the Director of Publishing Ethics and Integrity at Taylor and Francis Group. After completing a PhD in neuroimmunology from the University of Bath, and then a postdoctoral position in neuroscience at the School of Pharmacy in London, Sabina moved from research into scientific publishing in 2008. And she's since held a number of positions in publishing, including the chief editor of the BMC Medicine, that journal, and also editorial director of the F1000 platforms. Sabina joined Taylor and Francis Group in 2018, and there she leads the Publishing Ethics and Integrity team on providing expert advice and support to editorial teams on ethical research, integrity, peer review, and policy matters, with the aim of minimizing risk and ensuring compliance to the highest publication ethics standards. Dr. Haseeb Ifranullah is a biologist turned development practitioner who often introduces himself as a research enthusiast. Over the last 2 decades, he's worked for a number of different international developmental organizations, academic institutions, donors, and the government of Bangladesh in a variety of capacities. Currently, he's an independent consultant on environment, climate change, and research systems, and he's also a visiting research fellow at the University of Liberal Arts, Bangladesh. He's also an associate of INASP in the UK, and he's been involved in mentoring and designing and facilitating capacity building sessions and dialogues for young and mid-career researchers, and also journal editors to improve their understanding of journal publishing practices and standards. And finally, he's one of the chefs of the Scholarly Kitchen blog. Haseeb has a PhD in aquatic ecology from the University of Liverpool in the UK. So thank you. I'm going to turn over now to our presenters.
Thank you so much, Carol. I will attempt to share my screen now. So if you'd let me know if can you see this?
Yes.
Okay, great. Excellent. Does that look right or?
It's showing the notes screen. There, that's it.
Yeah, okay,
yep.
Thank you. This is always the trickiest part for me. But thank you very much for the invitation. I'm delighted to join you all today. I've been noting in the chat from all over the world, and it's a pleasure for me to join you all along with Haseeb and my other colleagues here to talk about a subject that is very close to my heart, which is publishing ethics. And we're going to start with a brief overview of what publication ethics is. I mean, what do we mean by it when we talk about it? Who guides this and why is this important? I'll briefly show you some common issues which arise and what we as publishers need to do in order to ensure the integrity of the scholarly record. We'll then actually go through some of those specific types of issues that can arise, but put them in the format of some cases as well. So we'll actually be presenting some cases to you, and we'll be asking you to provide your answers in terms of what you think the outcome of those should be, just to, get us all into a bit of a discussion mode as well. And those responses from you will be done via Mentimeter. So my colleague Victoria will help us with that part. And then we'll finish off with some tips for authors. And all throughout this, we're hoping this will be an interactive discussion, not just from me, but also to hear from Haseeb and his views, and any of you as well as we go along. So first of all, publishing ethics. What is this? The first thing I want to point out is it's not something that is owned or governed by any one entity or organization. This is very much a consensus-based system around best practice and standards for publishing. The consensus is between a variety of stakeholders. So that includes us as publishers, but also scholarly and learned societies and other key organizations who are very much geared towards the education and standard setting for best practice. So COPE is the one you may have heard of the most, the Committee of Publication Ethics, but there are others as well. And what this is designed to do is to ensure that we as publishers follow similar standards in order to protect the integrity of the scholarly record, because we need to ensure we're publishing content that can be trusted. And why we need to do that is because the whole point of publishing scholarly research is to help others build their research. So if there's a break of trust in this entire system, that's not good for anyone. And that's why we focus on what are the best practices and standards in order to ensure the integrity of the work that is published. One of the ways we do this in a more kind of standard way is to ask authors to declare key statements within their articles that they are submitting to us. And that's because we need to ensure that there is transparency around ethical research standards. So some of the common things that you will experience when you're submitting to various journals, whether that's Taylor & Francis or other journals, will be the expectation to provide a statement on the approval for the research. And this does differ by study design. If the research is very interventional in nature, for example, if it involves something like a clinical trial, we're expecting to see ethical approval was obtained from an ethics committee. And this can vary from subject area and by study design. but it's one of the reasons we ask for this. We also ask to see statements on informed consent from research participants, or if they're underage, from their guardians. And this is to ensure that the research that is being conducted where humans have been involved as the participants has been conducted ethically. So we're expecting to see statements in the article around approval for the research, informed consent if it's relevant. Also, if the research involves animals, then we're expecting to see statements around approval for the use of those animals, and also the ethical handling of the animals. So we would often refer to ARRIVE guidelines, because that gives some detailed guidance around what key elements should be reported in the article if your work involves especially in vivo work with animals. On the topic of consent, the other thing we would be paying attention to is if the content of the article can potentially identify someone because of the level of detail that has been given about them, then we are expecting to see consent to publish. And this is because we have to ensure that nobody's privacy or right to privacy is being breached. So if someone can be identified, then that's one of the things we would ask authors: did you get consent to publish? As standard, we would expect statements around competing interests. These can be financial or non-financial, and also funding and sponsorship. So who has funded the work, who has sponsored the work, declaring that to acknowledge it is also important. When it comes to publication ethics and integrity, there are many, many different types of issues that come up. Too many for me to list here. So what I did is just list it by what is the most common thing that comes up. The first and second row shows many problems that crop up, often due to a lack of full understanding or maybe confusion around standards and policies. For example, authorship criteria, or things like what are competing interests and why should they be declared. The third row, though, so where we're looking at things like data fabrication, image manipulation, this is when we're moving into much more conscious misconduct. So this is deliberate misconduct in order to get articles published just to get them published, so without any due care towards the integrity of the work. So this is where we deal with things like data fabrication or image manipulation, or even unethical research. So there are many types of issues that actually come up. And when these come up, it doesn't just affect the publisher. There will often be other stakeholders who would be affected, for example, institutions, because sometimes when we start an investigation, we also need to contact the institution as well. So if we have published something that does require some kind of revision or correction, there are particular methods that we need to follow. And that goes back to what I said right at the beginning, these standards of best practices for publishing ethics. So if after publication, we need to correct the scholarly record in some way, there are two main ways we would do this. One is through a correction notice, and the other is through a retraction. In the slides coming, I will show you examples of the criteria we would use for that. Under some other circumstances, there will be other types of notices that we might publish, which could be expression of concern or removal. And again, I'll show you some examples. The key point to remember is these are all attached to the original article. So original article does not disappear. As a publisher, we have a responsibility towards permanency of content. So we can't just silently remove articles because we have published them and there is a record. So if we need to correct it in some way, we will attach a permanent post-publication notice to it. And the purpose of this is not to blame or shame anyone. It's just to correct the scholarly record. So researchers can, choose to use which articles or which data in the articles they're publishing that they feel they can trust. So first, we'll briefly talk about correction notice. When will we issue this? So we will issue this when there's no serious breach of publication or research ethics. This is only to correct minor errors, which do not change the overall conclusion of the article. So it could be something like something was mislabeled, or there was some inaccuracy that needs to be corrected, but the overall article is still valid. It doesn't need to go through further assessment or review. And there are no other concerns about the integrity of the article. So here's an example. One of the first things you will see is why is the article being corrected? So the example here is where there was an error in the table, and the authors noted the error and they needed to report the correct values within that. But changing the values didn't actually change the overall article. So a correction was allowed, and therefore it's valuable for anyone who is accessing the article, reading the article, to know at what stage this change was made, because they might have had an earlier version of the article. So this is why we need to be very clear about the change was made, this is the change, this is when it was made, so that readers can be sure of the version that they are looking at. When there is a serious issue, and this could be like a serious breach of publication ethics, for example, duplicate publication or serious plagiarism, or research integrity issues, for example, data falsification, that means the article is no longer valid. And by not being valid, that means we have to retract it. It can also be honest error. So sometimes it's the authors themselves who've noticed a problem. So they've noticed there's actually a fundamental error in our data that invalidates the work. And so they can request a retraction, which is very good scholarly behavior. And so we would always reflect that within the retraction notice. We would say the authors are retracting this. The key thing we as publishers have to keep in mind is the retraction notice should be factual. Again, it's not about blame, it's just explaining what the problem was. The original article does not disappear. It will remain online with a retracted watermark across it and with this retraction note permanently attached to it. So here's an example of one. So one of the first things you'll see is who is retracting this article. So here it's the editors and the publisher. And then you'll see why are we retracting the article. So here we're talking about there were concerns about the integrity of the data. The authors were approached, they checked their data, and actually they confirmed that there are fundamental errors present. So they've agreed to the retraction of the article. So this then makes it clear for any reader who might have seen an earlier version of the article that, oh, it's been retracted, so I'm not going to build my own research based on the data in this particular paper. The other thing we need to consider sometimes is an expression of concern notice. We have to consider very carefully when we will do this, because again, it is a permanent notice. And we will issue it when we think it's actually important for us to alert the readership. It can be the investigation is taking a long time. It will usually be around something quite serious, but we would have to make a decision about whether or not saying something while the investigation is going on is going to create more harm. And if we think that is the case, we will issue an expression of concern, and the authors will always be informed of that as well. And again, the purpose here is to alert readers. So again, it comes back to any researchers forming hypotheses or building their research will then know, actually, I won't take this paper into account while I'm building my own research. So here's an example of one. So here, again, you'll see who is responsible for issuing this concern. And here it's the publisher and editor. And then you see why are we doing this. So in this particular case, there were serious concerns about the scientific integrity of the article content. And we reached out to the authors. They were not responding. We were asking them to verify the information about the article's integrity, but they were not responding despite various chases. So given the nature of what this work was, we felt it was important to issue an expression of concern. And the reason is reflected in the last sentence, that as we continue to work through the issues raised, we advise readers to interpret the information presented in the article with due caution. Now, in some very, very rare cases, we will consider removal. And what I mean by removal is the content of the article is removed, not the record of the article. So the record of the article remains. If you have the citation details, if you have a link to the article, you will still find a record of it. It's just we had to remove the content. And we will do that when the content itself poses a serious risk. So it could be that there are concerns around defamation or other legal concerns. It could be the content is actually sensitive. It's not allowed to be shared because maybe it's subject to a court order. It could be the content itself poses a very high risk of harm, and therefore removal is the best outcome here. Or it could be breach of privacy. So someone's personal information or detail has been published without their consent and it is breaching their privacy. Often they are requesting removal and therefore we have to remove it. So I'll show you an example here. In this particular one, you'll see the editors and publishers, we use the term withdraw here, withdrew the article for legal reasons. So this was a case of defamation. And so the only outcome we could have was to remove it for legal reasons. So now I will hand over to Haseeb for his thoughts specifically.
Thank you very much, Sabina, for superbly touching upon all the major key elements of ethics in publications. Definitely, we will be looking into some of those in detail. I will essentially touch upon why, from the Global South, I understand that almost all of the participants are from the Global South, like me. Why should we be aware of publishing ethics and abide by it? We shouldn't consider, and can't consider that it is something imposed by big publishers, big entities, research entities from the North or from the West. And it has not much to do with us. No, it is not like that. Since we are part of a global knowledge system, we cannot find ourselves, or we cannot, to be specific, we cannot put ourselves in isolation. We have to think scholarly publishing or research ethics as researchers, as authors, as editors, as publishers, as well as reviewers. Because in many cases in the Global South, we know that our journals are essentially society and institutional journals. And often the same person is wearing different hats, often as a volunteer. So to make our research part of the global research enterprise, we must value, we must appreciate, we must follow ethics. I appreciate that our contexts are different, and the different tools, ethics-related tools that we may or we are supposed to use may vary. Our funding landscape is quite different from the global north. Our recruitment, our promotion rules, these are also quite different from the developed countries. But we have to follow some basic norms, basic standards, basic rules, as we are the citizens of scholarly world. I also believe that sometimes we researchers think ethics as something quite complicated, something quite uncomfortable. Sometimes fear works. Sometimes we are kind of agitated by legal implication of breaching ethics. Or sometimes we just simply try ourselves, making ourselves distant from the conversation on ethics. And I must admit before you that I probably used to be one of them. But as a responsible citizen, practicing ethics, we are practicing ethics in every sector, isn't it? As a professional, as a teacher, as a father, as an individual of a society, of our society. If we are practicing ethics everywhere in all sectors of our lives, why shouldn't we do it in our research sector as well? Our life as a researcher, our life as an editor as well. So we need to embrace ethics sportingly. Sometimes I wonder that our conversation of ethics is quite serious, isn't it? I was just wondering whether it could be fun as well, because sometimes we try to overcome certain challenges of ethics, and it could be quite an interesting story to share. I'm sure that there are so many experiences or thoughts are among the participants of today's webinar. And I'm sure you will be starting, typing some of your stories, which others could be learned from. And I'm looking forward to that conversation. And thank you all for listening to me. Sabina?
Thank you, Haseeb. And that was such an inspiring summary, I think, of why it matters to all of us. And I love the phrase you used, citizens of the scholarly world. I think that's absolutely right. And everything that we do as well, as publishers, it doesn't matter where we're based. Anything we published is going out into the world. And that's why it's relevant to absolutely all of us. So thank you so much for that. So now we're going to move into some specific topics, and how this will be structured is I will at first show you some of the standards and definitions around this, but then we're going to take a look at some cases and we'll kind of come to you for some of those answers. So let's start first with authorship. Now, I've included authorship deliberately here because authorship is one of the most common areas of problems that we see. And usually because of not a full appreciation or understanding about authorship criteria. Why is it important for us to have authorship criteria? Why do we as publishers care so much about it? It's really about the accountability, because anyone who has done the work and is saying they are an author in the work is accountable for it. So Taylor and Francis, like most other publishers, will have an authorship criteria. And that's what I'm showing you here. So the first point we have is that anyone being listed as an author, and it doesn't matter if you're author number 1 or 5 or the last one, doesn't matter. Anyone being listed as an author must have made a significant contribution to the work because they're a representative of this work. And that could be anything. It depends on the study design, the conception, execution, analysis, etc. That's between the authors. That's not something we would necessarily explore, but it is because they have made a significant contribution. But that's not where it ends, because part of this is about disseminating that work and communicating the work. So actually all listed authors have a role in the writing and the drafting and the revising of the articles. So it might be that 1 or 2 of the authors took the responsibility to write the paper, but anyone listed as a co-author must have at least critically reviewed it, because it's their work. So they have to all agree, this is the outcome, this is the interpretation, this is the data we will show, this is what we want to submit to the journal, which is point number 3. Agreeing on the journal to which the article will be submitted. The reason that's important is because, again, one of the more common areas of unintentional misconduct we see is duplicate submission or publication. And sometimes that happens because of a miscommunication between the co-authors. So one author might submit it in one journal and the other author, misunderstanding, submits it in a different journal. They've actually committed misconduct by doing that, because you cannot submit to more than one journal at the same time. And so part of our criteria is that all of the authors listed have to agree which journal are we submitting to. And then there's a responsibility towards reviewing and agreeing on all versions of the article, because it can change. The version that has been submitted might be revised in response to the editor questions or reviewer comments, so it will change by the time it is accepted. So being aware of any significant changes is also important, because it's all about that last point, number 5. Any listed author agrees to take responsibility and be accountable for the contents of the article. So it's important to remember that any listed author is a representative of that paper and they share accountability. The corresponding author does have a particular role because they will be the main point of contact between their co-authors and the editor and the journal. But they also sign a legally binding publishing agreement. If the article is accepted, they will sign this, and they sign it on behalf of the co-authors. So it's important to remember that authorship is not a trivial thing. It actually comes with responsibilities, which is why it is important to publish under your name. But there are some specific types of misconduct that we see. So one is gift authorship. So this is where someone has not actually contributed to the work. They're not involved at all in the work, but they're gifted an authorship position. Why that happens, there are many reasons. Sometimes it's to make someone happy. Sometimes it might be an exchange of benefits. It can be for any kind of reasons. But if that person has not actually been involved in the work at all, then they should not be listed as an author. So it's a dishonest representation of who is involved in the work. And like I said, anyone listed as an author is accountable for the work. So if they haven't been involved, then they can't be accountable. So that's also why it's considered misconduct. And more seriously, sometimes it happens without the knowledge of whoever has been gifted the authorship. So sometimes a junior researcher might add the name of a more senior colleague because they think it might be received more favorably in, for example, the journal, but that person doesn't even know and they weren't involved. And that's serious because that person has now become accountable for something they have nothing to do with. And so that's why it's really important to not take this lightly, that it is only people who are accountable for the work, who have done the work, should be listed as an author. Ghost authorship is kind of the opposite. So this is where someone has done the work, they have contributed significantly, they have influenced the research, the data analysis and conclusions, but they are not listed as an author. So first of all, anyone who has done the work should get credit for that. If they meet authorship criteria, they should absolutely be an author. But sometimes it is done deliberately, and it's done deliberately to conceal their involvement because they might have a relevant competing interest that they don't want anyone to know about. And so they choose not to be an author on the paper. And that's why this is a problem, because again, someone who has contributed to the work, who has influenced the work, is not transparent about their involvement. Another type of serious misconduct we see is where authorship slots are actually sold. So this can happen through organizations. We refer to them as paper mills. And this is the sale of authorship to people who have not directly conducted the work. It's really people buying their way on as an author. And these articles, because they're coming from a dishonest source anyway, because they're selling authorship, the papers themselves also have problems. They usually have fake data, manipulated images, high levels of plagiarism, etc., etc. So this leads to the publication of dishonest and unreliable work, even duplicate publications, because we see examples of the same paper, but with completely different authorship lists, because that was sold to different groups for money. And of course, we would need to take steps to retract that. And it's important that authors are aware that this is a very risky thing to do, because it causes really big reputational damage for them and their institutions. The other thing to bear in mind is acknowledgement. So it's ethical practice that if someone has helped you in some way related to the work, but they don't meet authorship criteria, then it's ethical to acknowledge their contribution in an acknowledgement section. And most of the time, it's absolutely fine. Everyone is happy with that. But it's important for authors to be aware that they should notify the person or the people they are thanking by name in the acknowledgement section, because they have a right to say, actually, I have a problem if you acknowledge me in this way. There are so many reasons. Often it's political. There might be some political reason. So they have a right to know that you're adding their name there, and they have a right to be able to say, actually, I have a problem if you do this. The more common reason is because sometimes the person being acknowledged actually thinks they meet the authorship criteria. So they might say, well, hang on, I actually helped you quite a lot. I meet the authorship criteria. I should be an author. Why are you acknowledging me? So there's an authorship dispute. So it's much, much better to have that conversation early on before you've submitted, so everyone can be clear who should be an author, who should be acknowledged. And anyone being acknowledged by name is aware that you are doing that. And at Taylor & Francis, when you submit to one of our journals, we actually ask this question as well, that if you have named someone in the acknowledgement section, have you obtained permission from them? Have you notified them? Just to be sure of that. So it's an area lots of authors, just because I'm not thinking of the detail, might make mistakes, and it causes lots of problems later on. So just being aware of it early on will avoid all of those problems. So very quickly, we would, when there are changes to authorship lists, because it is such a serious thing, we would actually follow a proper process for that. At Taylor & Francis, we have a form that any changes made are requested to be recorded on. And if the article has been accepted already, the authorship change may not be accepted unless there is a very, very strong reason. So I've just shown you here a screenshot of our policy on this. But now I think we're going to I'm going to hand over to Victoria, because there's going to be a question that we ask you to answer in a word cloud. So over to you, Victoria, for Mentimeter.
Are you able to see that?
Yes, yes.
Great.
So I think if you go to menti.com and use the code that is showing there, we're asking you to just add in just your thoughts on what ethical challenges related to authorship have you faced lately. We would love to know that from you. So we'll just give you a few moments to get onto menti.com and provide your answers. Okay, authorship order, none, yeah. Are these the complete results, Victoria? Oh no, they're still coming. Okay.
Yeah, they're just starting to load.
Okay.
It takes some time to log on, I think.
Yeah, no, fair enough.
As
So,
we are,
yes, sorry, go on.
as we are waiting for the results coming in, I just listening to you, Sabina, I thought that there is a kind of power relation, isn't it? When we are talking about deep authorship and ghost authorship, who is powerful and who is influenced to become ghost, and who is powerless or less powerful. So less powerful becoming ghost, and powerful ones becoming the gift author. So it's a very interesting thing. And you have also pointed out some quite broad things, which is, it is just put on your, you have to deal it with the very beginning, but some issues are quite subtle, isn't it? Who should be acknowledged and who should be authored? So it's a brilliant idea that even get the consent from the people who should be acknowledged, so that there is no problem comes up later on. These are brilliant tips. Thanks for those, Sabina.
Oh no, thank you so much, Haseeb. And you're absolutely right about the power relationship. We're very aware, and actually when I was a researcher as well, I saw that firsthand, how how power can lead to those issues like gift authorship and ghost authorship. And it's why we do, you know, we really try to reach out to institutions and do this sort of work, because sometimes it's about just not thinking about the responsibility of authorship. Sometimes there's oh, if I can get 10 papers or in a year, it's great. If I can get 15, it's wonderful, but not necessarily thinking through what that means about the accountability of that. And I think this discussion around authorship criteria is, I would say maybe in the last 10, 15 years has become more, there's more of an emphasis on it. Certainly when I was a researcher, I never thought about authorship criteria. I just thought, whatever my supervisor says. I didn't think about, you have to meet a certain criteria. So yeah, it's an area often overlooked.
I think in the interest of time, we should probably move forward. So I'll stop sharing screen now.
Yeah, it's great to see lots of, I mean, I'm happy to comment on some. I'd love to hear from Haseeb as well, like your thoughts on this. I'm seeing a lot the things like authorship order, you know, list of like order of authors, authorship order. I'll comment on that quickly. That is an issue that, you know, we would sometimes we get complaints from someone saying I should be author number 1, but I'm author number 3. We would always say that's nothing to do with us as the publisher. That's between the authors, and if there is a kind of a disagreement between the authors, we would refer to the institution. But actually, it's one of the reasons why us being much better at being transparent as publishers and helping authors to be clear about their contribution to the article is very important, because it shouldn't be about the author number, it should be about the contribution. And I acknowledge that we need to do more as publishers, that there is credit taxonomy that is available, but actually something we need to do better is how can we enable authors in whichever order they are in to list their contribution in a way that is going to help them and be meaningful to them. So that's, I'll just comment on that, but I wonder if Haseeb wants to comment on something.
Yeah, I think you performed quite a, and there was a question on order of authorship in the Q&A as well. So you have covered that bit as well. There are some cases as well. And I think although different words are written, but co-authorship, positioning, these are under, or lead authorship, these also fall under order of authorship. Yeah, that's a big challenge, isn't it? But I understand that there are certain issues that has to be taken care of within the institution, but not, there is no responsibility per se which the publishers can do. Definitely they can organize events, that's it, isn't it? And the tools, the forms, the guidelines, those should be abided by. Otherwise, there is serious implication. It could be legal implication as well. So we have to be dealing with authorship, order of authorship, lead authorship, percentage of contribution. Those should be taken from the very beginning. Thank you.
Absolutely. No, well said. Thank you. So I will try to share my screen again. And can you see this properly? Like you see? Yeah, great. Thank you so much. Excellent. So now that was great. It was really good to get everyone's thoughts on that. So now we're going to move to a case, and this is a case of authorship. So in this particular scenario, there was an article listing several authors that was peer-reviewed and accepted for publication by the editor. After acceptance, the collaborator who made significant contributions to the analysis and the revised draft asked why have they not been included as an author. The authors had a discussion and they agreed the collaborator has provided a strong argument for why they meet the authorship criteria. In the meantime, the corresponding author has received the proofs from the production team, meaning that the article has already been typeset and it's getting ready to get published. So the question is, and we're going to go back to Mentimeter, The question is, what should the authors do? So you're going to see the following 3 questions. So what I will do, if I stop sharing and I hand, so Victoria can take us back to the number on Mentimeter. Oh, already some answers coming in. Excellent. So the questions are, what should the authors do? Proceed with no further changes because it's too late to add an additional author. Tell the collaborator they will add them as an author on their next article rather than this one. Or immediately contact the editorial and production team to request the change to the authorship list. So we'll just wait a few moments for people to answer. So it does look like overwhelmingly it's option 3. Immediately contact the editorial and production team to request the change to the authorship list. Okay, I think, yeah, there we go. So yes, most of you got that right. It is about option 3, and that's because the person who collaborated did it on this article. So it's not about adding them later, and it's not about ignoring their contribution. It is absolutely about contacting the editorial and production team to say, we've accidentally left off an author, we now need to add them as onto the authorship list. Excellent. So let's go to the next section. So now we're going to talk about duplicate submissions and publications. Again, this is an area where we see a lot of problems. The key thing to bear in mind is you cannot submit to more than one journal at the same time. And actually, when you are submitting to a journal, this is one of the key declarations you make in the submission system, because there are issues around originality and also the rights that the publisher has to handle this article and send it to reviewers. So we have to ask, is this original? Is this under submission somewhere else? Because if it is under submission somewhere else, we then can't handle it. So it's very important to remember that. If you find that by accident, it's been submitted to 2 or 3 different journals at the same time, we would always say, inform the journals immediately that you have to withdraw, because you can withdraw your article if you want to. It's just that you can't have it under submission at the same time. Also, let's say the article goes on to be accepted. You'll receive a legally binding publishing agreement. And one of the questions around there is about the originality, is about the fact this is an original article that can be published. Because again, as publishers, we can't publish something that someone else has published, so there are legal reasons for this. The rules aren't there just to be difficult, it's because there are actually legal implications. And the corresponding author, as I mentioned before, signs this on behalf of all co-authors, so everyone is collectively accountable. There are some scenarios where a duplicate submission or publication might be okay. One example is a translation. So let's say you have an article that has already been published in another language, and now you want to translate it and publish it in, let's say, an English language journal because you want wider dissemination. Now, many journals will accept that, but the key is you have to be clear. You have to be transparent with the editor. And if the editor is also thinking, yes, I will accept I will consider a translated article, there are other factors you have to take into account. For example, where was the original article published? Does that publisher have any requirements or restrictions around you publishing an English language version. Who translated the article is also important. Is it the author themselves, or is it a different person? Because if it's a different person, they need to be credited for that. That needs to be transparent. It was translated by so-and-so. And the authors also need to check any copyright or reuse restrictions. It also needs to be made clear in the article that it's a translation. So it can't be presented as a new research output. So the original article should be cited as well, and it should be referred to. So there are conditions of transparency and clarity that are required if that's something that you would be doing. We also fully expect that researchers will present their data at conferences. This could be in the form of short abstracts. That's generally not something we would consider as a duplicate submission or publication. If it's the full version though, then actually there may be some restrictions. But if it's just bits of the work and an abstract, a poster, that's not considered a problem. Also nowadays, it's becoming more and more important to share early versions of the work on, for example, a repository or a preprint server. So again, that's not something we would consider to be a problem, but transparency is key. And so the guidance here is any full previous versions should be highlighted so that it's clear immediately to the editor that there is another version out there, but you're not trying to hide it. So now we're going to go on to the second case. So here we have an article was published, and soon after publication in Journal A, the readers alerted that editor to the existence of the same article in another journal, Journal B. Now, the editor compared it and saw the content and author list was the same. The article was published in Journal A 3 weeks after Journal B. So it's exactly the same article published in 2 different journals, first published in Journal B and then in Journal A. So Journal A asked the editors for the authors for an explanation and reminded them that they had confirmed the article was original and not under consideration elsewhere. The authors responded and they explained that due to miscommunication among the authors, they submitted to 2 different journals in error. So we're going to go back to Mentimeter for you to choose which outcome for the editor you think is the most suitable. Already lots of answers coming in. That's great.
I should say a lot of the answers came in before you presented the case study. So
okay. Brilliant.
Sabina, as we are waiting for answers to coming in, I think as rightly mentioned that preprint has, the growth of preprint or the momentum of preprint has, exponential. It shows exponential growth over the last few years, especially during the COVID. And there are certain journals, publishers, certain journals, certain editors, they are kind of not reluctant. They have some reservation whether they would accept a manuscript which is already publicly available. So we have to be careful before uploading print and then submitting and read the guidance that whether they appreciate a submission of a preprint or not. Otherwise, we will be losing the submission of in a good journal. So those sort of new developments should be very much taken care of because these are evolving like anything, isn't it, Sabina?
That's a really good point, Haseeb. Thank you. Yes, with preprints in particular, it's really important to check the journal policies on that. The majority, nowadays, more and more publishers are accepting it, but there are some cases where the peer review model could be an issue. So if the journal you want to submit to has a double anonymized peer review model and you want to submit there, then actually having a preprint might compromise that. So there are a lot of those things to think about, but that's a really good point. Always checking, would this impact you in some way if you were to use a preprint? Thank you, Haseeb. That's a very good point. So we have quite a lot of answers already in, and it's overwhelmingly for the middle option, which is retract the article from Journal A as it was published after publication in Journal B. And yes, that is actually the right answer, because Journal A published an article that was already published somewhere else. So actually they couldn't have it, published, so it had to be retracted. Option 3, where you could retract it from both, that sometimes comes down to editor discretion. So sometimes the Journal B editor might also be equally angry about it and might say, do you know what, I'm actually going to retract this as well. So that could happen, but it wouldn't be a removal, it would be a retraction. But generally it would be option 2. Excellent. So now we're going to move to the next section. So this is plagiarism and text recycling. So plagiarism is, I'm sure most of you know, this is the appropriation, the use of another person's or group's ideas, processes, results, figures, or words without giving appropriate credit. Often when we talk about plagiarism, we think about it in terms of text, the words, but actually it could be all of these things. It could be the models, the results, that kind of thing. And it's about not giving appropriate credit. So, and this includes all kinds of content. When it comes to text plagiarism, we use, like most other publishers, we use specialist software for that. And many institutions will have that as well, because text plagiarism is a really big problem and is grounds for rejection of a manuscript or retraction of the article if it has already been published, because this is considered a serious form of misconduct. Now, one of the things we then also have to think about is, what about if it's self-plagiarism or something we also refer to as text recycling? What if it's not taking someone else's work, it's just reusing your own work? Then you're not stealing from anyone else. But it can also be a problem, because if you are excessively reusing your own work that you have already published, there's a question about novelty. There's a question about what is original if you are reusing so much of this. And it's seen as misconduct, because then that distorts the scholarly record, because you're putting out a lot more into the system of something that is actually not novel. And so it's that redundancy that becomes a problem. And so this again would be grounds for rejection of the manuscript or retraction if it has already been published. Now, when it's things like the overlap is in the methods section, that's generally not something we would worry about too much, because we expect researchers to use common methods and or build upon their own methods. But when this overlap is really around the results, around the novel parts of the manuscript, which should be like the discussion, that's when the question about redundancy comes up. Text recycling is a really nuanced area, and there's a lot of debate about what is okay or not okay. So one thing I wanted to share with you is the text recycling research project. The website is there, textrecycling.org, has some really good, clear guidance on what is or is not okay for text recycling. So the group here have produced some guidance about it. Full disclosure, I advised on this as well. I didn't lead it, but I was one of the contributors. But what they've tried to do is separate out the different types of reuse of work that can happen, and when it is okay or when it is not okay. So I highly recommend this as a resource to look at, and it's something we as publishers and editors are looking at as well, so we can provide some clear guidance. So now we will move to another case, and this is about redundant publication and text recycling. So in this case, upon submission, significant text overlap was detected with 2 recently published papers by the same authors, and those articles had not been discussed or cited. There was text overlap, and it was present throughout the manuscript, so not just the methods. Many of the figures and tables had also been reused from the published papers. Upon query, the authors confirmed there were no new significant novel findings, but explained they needed to publish more papers, which is why they submitted this. So we'll go back to Mentimeter, so you can choose the option of what should be the outcome here.
As results are coming in, there is another challenge or another risk of recycling text, isn't it? It is not only unethical that you are declaring it is novel, but you are just using the previously published data. But just imagine those papers are on the effectiveness of a medicine. You are actually repeatedly saying that the same medicine is effective, but it is not different people are saying that. It is you or your team is saying this particular treatment is effective. So it's a serious danger, isn't it? Public health danger.
Absolutely, that's a really good point. It's that distortion, you know, of the research, isn't it? So yeah, that's a really, really good point. And it looks like the majority of people are selecting that the editor should reject the submission because of excessive reuse, which is great. Some are commenting on that they should rephrase all the overlapping text, but the majority are going with option 1. Okay. So it looks like the majority of people are still editor should reject. So maybe we can discuss that now. Yep. So I would say, yes, it's an overwhelming response here about it, and it's the right response. This is about, there's so much overlap in the article. It's not just the text. So rephrasing it actually wouldn't, that's not the only problem, because they've used a lot of their own data, figures, tables. So actually the novelty is not there. And that's why the rejection is the most important outcome there. Great, thank you. So if we then continue with, right, excellent. So now we'll go on to the section about data and image handling and sharing. So it's important, again, to be very mindful of journal policies on images and data. There can be a lot of variation between publishers and journals, and it's becoming more and more required that authors should share some of their data, whether or not that's just with the editorial office or, you know, with the public as well. So I'm going to show you 3 slides. You don't have to read the whole thing, but I'm going to show you 3 slides of the Taylor and Francis editorial policies on images and data. When it comes to science, technology, and medicine in particular, there are some sort of standards we have around experimental images. And this is because sometimes they could be modified by the author, and sometimes the author modifies it without really meaning to change anything, but you have to be very careful about not modifying it to the point that you might change the result or might not show an honest representation of the result. So there's guidance about if it has been modified or enhanced in any way, that you have to be transparent about that. And usually you have to provide the original images to prove that it hasn't been modified in a way that is unethical. And in bold, I have here some key things to keep in mind, that authors should be prepared to share those original images with the journal editorial office upon request, because often the editorial team will want to verify that. And some journals have a mandatory data sharing policy that's becoming more and more common these days. So again, being very clear on what is the policy of the journal, and even if they don't have a mandatory data sharing policy, if you don't have the original images, original data to share, it might present a problem for you. So keeping that and storing that safely is actually really, really important. And the point about modifications is also important to bear in mind, that even if there are any kind of modifications, there's a limit to which up to which that can happen if these are experimental images. So keeping in mind that it's only acceptable if it's minor, and also if it's been applied to the whole image, not just to one little bit, because it might make your results look more exciting. So any modifications which can alter the scientific interpretation are not allowed. And then we also think about clinical images. Now, clinical images can sometimes have the patient details, like their name or their medical ID number. So you have to be careful to not include that kind of information in those types of images, because they have to remain anonymous. When it comes to the arts, humanities, and social sciences, there are other types of considerations. And this is keeping in mind that there are many cultural sensitivities or restrictions associated with images, which actually authors and publishers have to keep in mind. For example, there are some cultures or societies where images of human remains or deceased humans is restricted. And so if it's restricted, then we don't want to publish that. So we would have to work with the author on making sure that anything that should not be published, doesn't breach a guideline somewhere, isn't part of the content. Where researchers work with many indigenous communities, sometimes there are additional permissions that need to be sought based on how that community is structured. So it's not just about getting ethical approval from your institution. Sometimes it's also about getting that local level permission and specific permission if it's relevant to that particular community. So where this happens, we would say authors should include a statement to confirm that all necessary permissions have been obtained for the use and publication of such content. And this includes things like samples from museum collections. There could be an additional layer of permission that is required. So just being very mindful of, do you actually have permission to publish this, is something that will save you a lot of problems later on. And this is also thinking about, sensitive images. So the nature of some research requires that some of the content might be quite explicit or even pornographic, because that's the nature of the research. So if it's necessary to include that, then there has to be a clear warning statement so that readers can be alerted that actually there is something explicit here. And us as the publishers have to work on that as well. So, we have to be mindful about all of those things. And that it includes things like also publishing work in fields of conservation and heritage research, again, because of certain restrictions that could be in place. So just being aware of all of that will really help you. Another part of our editorial policy is around getting help from others with experiments and data analysis where they don't actually meet the authorship criteria. We talked earlier on about authorship and acknowledgements, but what I want to point out here is that, let's say some of the work was outsourced to a professional laboratory or data analyst. It's quite common, for example, in genomics. Not only does that have to be acknowledged, but authors are still responsible for retaining all of the original data. So because it's their research and you're publishing it in it, we would expect you to still have the files of your original data. Sometimes we have problems where we ask the author for the original data and they say, oh, we don't have it because we outsourced the work. And that raises all kinds of problematic scenarios. So it is your responsibility to have all of that original data related to the work. So we come on to this case now. After publication, a reader raises concerns about the analysis and interpretation of data in the article. Upon query, the authors check their data and confirm there was a coding error. So they reanalyzed it, and they found that the overall conclusions of the research remained unchanged. The authors supplied the editor with a full explanation and the original data files so that it could be verified by the editorial team. And the editor and editorial team confirmed the author's finding that they corrected the coding error, but it didn't actually change the overall conclusions. So here, what should be the outcome? We'll go back to Mentimeter.
Sabina, I realized that sometimes there are certain geographical information we often include in our research papers, which might lead to the smugglers and the pirates for biopiracy and that sort of thing, because those geographical information could be quite significant consequences. So as a researcher, we need to be aware of that what we are trying to do, it might have beyond research implication, isn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's absolutely right. I think that's the thing, is that the act of publishing has results, right? So it leads to something. So yeah, absolutely right. That is a really good point. Thank you.
Another quick note, listening to your cases and points you are trying to make and you are sharing, I believe that there are not only researchers among the audience, but also editors and future editors. So learning that they are responsible for managing a journal from the Global South. What are the issues, emerging issues they need to consider? Because data protection or data management, sometimes we are not quite aware of in the Global South.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I think but the angle I'm using here in the phrases is very much directed to authors, but you're absolutely right. I mean, if this can help guide editors, or as you say, future editors, in kind of arranging those editorial policies, that's essentially what we're trying to do here today as well. Like, be aligned with each other in terms of what is required and why as well. Now, I really want to at least give the awareness today that these rules that we have are not for nothing. They don't come out of nowhere. We have these rules and standards for essentially protection of everyone involved, to make sure we're publishing content in the right way and not harming someone in the process.
Absolutely. Thank you. Oh, there's a clear winner. Talk about it. Yeah.
This is very clear. Yeah, absolutely. So the author should highlight the error and a correction notice should be issued. Yeah, and there's one each in the other areas. So yeah, this is really clear as well. So, and that is absolutely right. In this case, what happened is there was no misconduct really. Well, we can't ignore it, obviously. The article is still valid. It's been verified that the changing the coding doesn't actually change the overall conclusions. So it is the correction notice that should be issued. And that's a nice example of how it is the author's responsibility as well to just make sure the article has been verified, checked, and if there is a problem, there are actions we can take. So had an overwhelming response there towards number 2. Okay, so we're reaching the end of the session now, and just as before we finish, I'm going to round this all off by providing some tips for authors. But of course, Haseeb, as you said, a lot of this will be relevant to editors or future editors as well. It's absolutely relevant. So first is authorship. We've talked a lot about authorship. So the main tip I have here is agree on authorship early on. Like, be aware of the criteria and the responsibilities and agree on that early on, and ensure that anyone who meets the authorship criteria has been included. When you're nominating who the corresponding author should be aware of what that means. Like if you're taking the responsibility of corresponding author, what is the role and responsibility? Is that corresponding author able to fulfill those responsibilities? So this includes things like ensuring all of their co-authors agree on the journal to submit to, ensuring all co-authors agree on any changes to the manuscript, including any changes to the authorship list if that's required, and ensuring all relevant declarations on funding and competing interests have been stated by the co-authors. So being really clear on all of that early on will really save you a lot of trouble later on. The next is about your data. Now, it's becoming more and more required that authors have to share their original data. It can either be because the editorial team requires it for submission checks, or it can be that the journal has a mandatory data sharing policy. Whatever the case, be aware that all of your original data should be securely stored and clearly labeled so you can find them when sometimes the queries about this happens after publication. So having a clear data management plan, again, will be really, really helpful for you and your co-authors and your institution. And to be ready to share the files with the journal editorial office upon request. And this can happen at any stage. It can happen at submission, it can happen at the review process, it can happen even after publication. And if your data includes personal information about participants, human participants in particular, then taking steps to anonymize that data set before sharing is also important. So just keeping those kinds of standards in mind. When you're looking for your journal, when you're shortlisting your journals that you want to submit to, check mandatory requirements. What does it mean for you if you are to submit there? Well, can you submit there? So all of the journals will have an instructions for authors page, which should give you detailed information that you should be able to find the editorial policies. Sometimes that's embedded within the instructions for authors. There will be confirmation about originality, as we mentioned about during submission stage. But some journals, and this is where you can get variation, some journals will have mandatory policies on certain things. So you could have a journal saying, if you submit here, it's mandatory that you share your data and you upload it in this repository. Now, if that's going to be a problem for you, then you know, actually, I shouldn't submit here because I can't give free access or public access to my data. But if that's not a problem for you, then you know, okay, I just need to prepare my files and upload it into the repository before I submit here. There could also be mandatory deposition and registration policies. For example, most journals that publish clinical trials will require you to have registered it in a publicly accessible database, and they're expecting to see the number. It could be gene expression data, it could be any number of things. So do just take the time to have a look at the journal policies and the requirements for submission before you submit there. Again, it will save you a lot of problem later on. Tip number 4 is being really aware of what are the key declarations on ethical conduct of the study and competing interests that you need to make in your article. Have you declared that? So these are things like statements on ethical approval for the study, statement on informed consent from research participants, ethics for data, which can impact privacy. If anyone can be identified from your from the article, this is particularly if it's a case history or something like that, then did you get consent for publication from them? And things like the competing interest statement, funding information, and acknowledge the assistance by anyone involved in the study or writing the paper. So having all of this in place, all of this prepared, again, not only will it save you problems, it will speed things up for you. Because if these are missing, then often what will happen with a lot of journals, the editorial team might be screening it beforehand. And if it's missing, then they have to come back to you and ask you questions, and you have to submit a revision. So you end up delaying things. So it's also faster for you if you have all of this information upfront in the paper as required, which relates to tip 3 I showed you before. Pay attention to the journal information instructions for authors. And then finally, tip number 5 is being mindful of what you are citing, being mindful about your reference list, and also if you have reused third-party materials, if you have obtained permission. So prior to submission, it's always good practice to check your manuscript for any unintended text reuse via a plagiarism checker. Now, this can happen very easily. You know, I totally understand this, you know, especially from my previous life as a researcher. When you're drafting the paper, you're using different sources or citing, and you can accidentally leave text in there that you didn't mean to leave in there. So if you have access to a plagiarism checker, which most institutions do, then run your manuscript through that plagiarism checker before submission, so you can pick up on any problems. And being clear about the references that you're using to provide evidence-based discussions to your work, so citing appropriate, balanced, and relevant sources. We talked at the beginning about articles that were retracted or have an expression of concern. So you don't want to cite those unless your research is about retractions, then, you know, but if you're finding that some articles you're referencing have ended up being retracted, then it may not be a good idea to cite that. So it's important to keep that in mind. And if any previous full versions exist online or other citable form, for example, preprints we just discussed, make sure you're clear about that. Some journals will say you have to cite it in your article, to be very clear. And if you have reused any like images or models or anything like that from a third party that is under a license, then making sure you've got permission from the copyright or license holder for reuse. Now, if it's something that has been published in an open license, so free to reuse, you just need to attribute, that's not a problem. But if it has been published under a restricted license, then you do need to check that, can you reuse it? And if you do reuse it, who do you need to get permission from? So again, that will save you a lot of problems later on. And I think that actually brings us to the end. So I will stop sharing now. Thank you very much for your attention.
Great, we have quite a few questions for the two of you. And I think we'll start with some of the more general questions. And the first question that came through was, can you distinguish between institutional research ethics and publishing ethics? So what are the difference between those two?
Yeah, I'm happy to say something to that. So institutional research ethics is what we would refer to as the institution ethics committee or review board assessing the research protocol and how the research will be conducted. So it's about assessing whether or not the research itself is ethical, and then what they need to do in order to do that research. What permissions do they need, or consent forms should they use? So that's not something we would as publishers be overseeing, but it's something we expect that the researcher's institution is overseeing. So that's why what we would ask for is a statement that who gave approval for this study? Did the study require approval? If so, who gave the approval? So when we don't expect to see that kind of documentation, but we do expect it to have been obtained. So the institutional research ethics is very much about the research design and how it will be conducted. The publication ethics is about, have we published a statement about how it was approved, how it was conducted? Have we paid attention to things like, did they get consent? Is that stated? And then all the other things we talked about, like plagiarism and, you know, reuse and that kind of thing. So the publication ethics is very much about the act of publishing and the consequence of publishing, essentially. So that's how we would differentiate the two.
Great. The next question is a bit of a two-parter. So there are issues where reviewers have stolen original ideas from the papers they have reviewed and submitted to other journals, and delay in submitting the review articles. So they are delaying the review process while they take that work and submit it elsewhere. So the question is, so what are some of the checks and balances taken by editors with reviewers who breach ethical standards?
I'm happy to answer that bit, but I'd love to hear from Haseeb as well about that. But what we would, I mean, that's awful when that happens. It's truly awful, and it's very disappointing. Reviewers are told when you're invited to review and you agree to review, you're told about confidentiality. You're told about, you know, not asking for things beyond the scope of what the work is, not sort of doing anything to deliberately delay. And the majority of reviewers are absolutely fine. I mean, we don't often see this, but if we have reason to believe that the reviewer has breached conduct, stolen ideas, then what we would do is we may report the reviewer to their institution, because this is serious misconduct and deliberate misconduct. And if that reviewer, if there's evidence to show that that reviewer stole these ideas and published it before our authors published it, we would also report it to that journal that published it. And then we would, you know, because we would then work together to show that this reviewer conducted misconduct, stole the ideas, and therefore we would actually have to resolve it that way. But the main checks and balances, I would say, is that we try to make it as clear as possible to reviewers this is confidential and you can't share the paper with anyone else. And if you are co-reviewing with someone, you need to inform them it's also confidential. But it is an awful scenario, but it does happen.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. We often reviewers because they are doing something voluntarily. They are the gatekeepers. But if the gatekeepers are, sorry to use the word thieves, then it is a really awful scenario. But it is all about integrity, isn't it? Integrity, I think C.J. Lewis once told that integrity is something that you are doing the right thing when nobody. So yeah, what else you can do? Definitely awareing reviewers, training them, also an important part of publishers' social responsibility as well. Thank you, Sabina, for your explanation.
Thank you as well. That's a good point about the training, actually. Yeah, that publishers do have that responsibility in reviewer training.
Yeah. Great. So we had a couple questions that are quite similar around preprints, and Haseeb, this might be a great one for you to answer because you wear many different hats. So the first question is, would you recommend that authors submit their manuscript as preprints if the journal under consideration permits preprints? And what are the benefits of preprint submissions? And then the other question is basically, what are the implications to authors for whom their article has been posted as a preprint but hasn't been published by a journal yet?
Yeah, there are lots of enthusiasm regarding preprints, no doubt about it. As we discussed, during the presentation, you need to be aware of what is the norm or standards. Of course, those norms and standards evolves within the disciplines. So preprints are much appreciated in physics and biological science probably nowadays. But you need to understand that you can't just believe that since it is true for other discipline, it will be true for my discipline as well. Or if it is true for other journal, it will be true for the journal I'm targeting. So it is very, very important that, because you put so much effort to finally conduct a complete research, not knowingly, if you just publish it as a preprint, oh my goodness, maybe there are so many big journals in your discipline, they might not be acknowledging or accepting your manuscript once again. So we have to be very careful. We need to understand the norm of our discipline. It is not like that we shouldn't just go by the flow. Of course, preprint has got many advantages because you are putting the authority or the priority of your research. That is fantastic. You are getting community review. That is fantastic. There are so many benefits. but we have to learn about it, and we have to go forward with a more or less complete understanding. That would be my answer.
Great. Fantastic. I just wanted to mention we have quite a few questions, and we're happy to continue with answering the questions, but it's likely that we're going to go over the time. I just thought I would highlight that. If there's any concerns with anybody on the organizing committee, let me know, but we'll just continue on otherwise. All right, moving to authorship issues. The first one is a question we get a lot, I think, Sabina, you'll agree, is there a limitation to the number of authors to be included on a paper?
Yeah, we do get a lot of questions on that. I would say, you know, when we talk about authorship, we're talking about across all of the disciplines. So we would never, or I would never say there should be a limitation on the author number. It should be about the contribution. Some fields, some types of research designs would require a large number of authors, and they have contributed and they should be listed. Some other types of papers, so for example, if we think of a review article, like a narrative review or an opinion article, wouldn't make much sense to have a very long author list there because it's an opinion article. So we would expect to see one or two authors. There's also a field specific issue there as well. So we notice in a lot of the humanities fields, it's quite common to have one or two authors. Whereas if you look in the medicine field, you'll have lots of authors. So it's all about the contribution. So, and that kind of links back to, I sort of mentioned a little earlier on about, I think we need to be better at being very transparent about level of contribution and therefore how someone fits on an article as an author, rather than worrying about the number of the authors or the order of the authorship. So the short answer is no, there should not be limitations, and the long answer I just gave you.
Great. Okay. The next one with the authorship issue, it's a little bit of a scenario and a question. So the authorship between professor and student, sometimes it's quite sensitive. I had this when I was an undergraduate student. My professor wanted me to publish my thesis as an article with her name and a colleague of hers first, but she and her colleague didn't make any contribution to the article. It's quite difficult for a student who was under the upper hand of some professors. And of course, I refused to publish my research this way, but the situation has happened with many students. Do you have any advice on this?
I can go first. I fully understand what is happening here. It is really a sorry scenario, no doubt about it. And if I go against my supervisor, my career could be ruined, you know, because you need the supervisor's references wherever you apply for a job, for a scholarship. So I think it is not the student who can solve the problem. It is the system that needs to be solving the problem. And the student cannot, an undergrad or master's student cannot influence the system because the system doesn't understand the whole practice is unethical. They may say that it is the norm. Why you are bothering about it? It is just an undergrad thesis. Just go for it. Listen to your supervisor. But I think the more we discuss these issues, the more we communicate, the realization will come in. But frankly speaking, coming from the Global South, I wouldn't go fighting against my supervisor because the system will not support me. That is maybe it is a kind of a negative pessimist view, but that's the reality we need to appreciate. But on the other hand, if it is where the system supports you, there is ombudsman present, there is an ethical committee, you can always negotiate with your supervisor because he or she will be aware of that what might be the implication if he or she steals the authorship. That would be my answer. Thank you.
Thanks. Great. The next question is, how should supervisors and collaborators in fellowships be listed in authorship?
I can answer that. Again, it would be about the contribution to the article and the tradition in that discipline. So as we know in STM fields, it would often be that the supervisor who obviously has supervised the work, so obviously has contributed, is often listed last because they have contributed, but it's a very kind of, it's just a tradition thing rather than anything else. So I would say that whether or not they're a supervisor or collaborator, there's this field specific tradition, or it would really just come back down to the level of contribution and what people have agreed to, you know, in terms of the authorship order about being listed. The most important thing though is that they meet the criteria to be an author on the paper. There are some disciplines where it's tradition to just list people in alphabetical order by their surname, so that there's no hierarchy. There's a bit more of a move towards that within the humanities and social sciences. So I would say there's an element here about what is the tradition in the field, and actually what is the level of contribution. And if you can put in an authorship contribution statement, even better, because it's about what is your, as a collaborator, what did the collaborator do? What did the supervisor do? So I would always link it back to the level of contribution first, and then think about the order second.
Great. I think that answers the next question as well, which was about knowing the importance of the position of an author. I think you addressed that as well. And then we have a question from Dr. Bila in Bangladesh, wanting to know about gift authorship, but I think Haseeb, you answered that one, because it's a little bit about that relationship between senior faculty co-authoring papers, or co-authoring papers with quotes around that. Here's a question. Are the authors listed on a paper contacted by editors to find out what exactly they contributed to? Is that something that occurs with any regularity?
So generally, the main contact between the editorial office, editor, and the author would be the corresponding author. Upon submission, most journals will send an alert to all listed co-authors, so then they have a record of the article, but otherwise all of the interaction will really be done via the corresponding author. The only time that we would start reaching out to co-authors about anything, level of contribution, anything, is when there might be a problem. There could be a dispute, but it's not general practice. Generally, it would be that's why the role of the corresponding author is so important. And that also comes down to the level of contribution. So if there's an author contribution statement, or if the journal has credit taxonomy implemented, then again, it would be, we would just look at what is there. If we have questions, has the corresponding author relayed that back? Sometimes we might require that all of the co-authors are CC'd, so we can confirm that everyone is in consensus. But otherwise, yeah, I would say the most standard thing is the editorial office and the corresponding author having direct contact.
Great.
Nowadays, I think there are certain journals, they have their automated system that they generate not only the information that a manuscript has been submitted, you as a co-author, why don't you go and confirm on the site that you are the co-author? So there are so many layers of what you call it, management of, ensuring that authorship is being handled properly. Thank you.
No, that's a great point, Haseeb, because I think that's also with ORCID IDs. So if you're a co-author, there are some journals will also allow you to, at publication, add your ORCID ID as well. So, but yet they would mainly be automated systems. It's a good point.
Yeah. We have a question about plagiarism. Regarding text plagiarism, is there a maximum number of direct quotes from previous publications that you can include on a manuscript? What's the magic number?
There's no magic number. There's no magic number at all. We hear it often, oh, 10% is okay, 30% is okay. There's no magic number. It is about what has been copied, how much has been copied, and the context in which it has been copied. If there are things like the methodology, there's overlap, that's normally not a huge concern because we know methodology will be fairly common and then we will overlap. But if there's overlap in the data, if there's overlap in the discussion, it doesn't matter if it's 10% or 30% or 40%. What matters is what has been plagiarized. It will always come down to that. So sorry to say there's no magic number.
Okay. Let's see. Here's one from the data section. How does the evidence of consent from those acknowledged in publication look like? So what does that document look like? Is it an email? Is it an actual form? What do people need to produce?
So consent for publication. So this is if someone can be identified and the authors need to get consent for publication. So at Taylor & Francis, we have a form that the authors can download and use. Some authors institutions have this as well, but the form will capture the fact that there's a declaration, this work is going to be published, they acknowledge they could potentially be identified, the person who, or their guardian who can potentially be identified signs it, and so does the author. We do not require to see a copy of those forms because they're sensitive documents. They have people's signatures and so on. What we do advise authors keep a copy of it in case we need to see it. What we require of the author is a clear statement in the article to say consent for publication was obtained from the persons who have been described here. And that's only if they can be identified potentially, not definitely, but potentially. If it's about consent for participation, so this is if you are a research participant, what we are looking for is the statement to say informed consent was obtained from the participants of the research. So we're looking for the statements. That's the key for us.
In case of acknowledgement, I think as Sabina, you mentioned that the persons who will be acknowledged, whether they are agreeing to be acknowledged, I don't think there is any consent form for that yet, isn't it? It's just the email communication.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yes, you can acknowledge me. So it should be no verbal.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right, Haseeb. So we would expect that the authors have had some discussion with whoever. We don't need to see forms or anything, but what we're asking is when they submit, there's a question in our submission that I confirm anyone I have named in the acknowledgement section has been notified and give permission, and they just tick it. And that's all we need. It's just a declaration.
Okay, I'm going to ask one last question because we really have run over time. And this question is a little bit like a math question you would have gotten received in elementary school. So you really need to pay attention. So it says, thanks for the insights. I have a question. Is it ethical to submit paper number 2 of research, having an accompanying paper number 1 under review? So the 2 papers are in 2 different journals. At that point, in what way should paper number 1 be referenced by paper number 2 when actually paper number 1 is still under review? Assuming paper number 2 uses a great amount of background work from paper number 1, but you wouldn't want to repeat the content from paper number 1. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. I can go first.
Yeah.
I think we do it a lot, especially when we are doing say a PhD. So there are so many different components, part of it. Often we mention that data unpublished, isn't it? Mm-hmm. But if already submitted it somewhere without declaring or disclosing which journal we have published, we can always refer to it under review or something like that. And if before the publication, the other paper, I don't want to go to into detail, paper number 1, paper number 2. If one paper gets published, we can always refer to it in the final proof event. So in summary, yes, cross-referencing is always possible, but we have to be honest that it is unpublished or under review or in press, whatever it is. And we do it, especially in the biological science, ecological science, we do it. Sabina?
Yeah, I think you covered that really well. It is about that transparency. That is the most important thing. And if the article, like you said, if by proof stage, let's say paper number 2 is being proofed, and while it's being proofed, paper number 1 has just been accepted, then you could inform the journal with paper number 2 that, look, I now no longer need to refer to this as unpublished data. I can give you a citation and say in press. So that's really the most important thing, is just being really transparent, because not being transparent leads to so many problems that we all want to avoid.
Okay, thank you so very much for this amazing presentation today. I want to thank you on behalf of everybody who's attended. I'm sure everybody feels the same as I do. I'm going to now just take 2 minutes to quickly wrap up from this webinar, and I want to point out 3 different things to you. The first is that if you go to the Research for Life website, you can find additional resources to help you with your publication and research process. So I'd recommend that everybody explores that. And also that please do fill in our webinar, our post-webinar survey, because this is a pilot series, and we will take on board feedback, and so that we improve the series as we go along, and offer it in the future. And you know that the recordings and presentations are all going to be available at the website that you can see at the link that you can see on the slide. And finally, next week we have our next webinar, which is about it's webinar 5, getting published, how to increase your chances of success. So if you're not already signed up for that, please do sign up for it. And then thanks again to Sabina and Haseeb for an amazing webinar.
Thank you so much, everybody. Take care.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, you too. Fantastic.